Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 379 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. We will look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, Jimmy will be answering listeners' weird questions. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode as we'll have your feedback on our recent episode on the Drake equation. But first, Jimmy, what do we need to say to begin today's episode?
Well, today's episode is not a Fifth Friday, so it was originally planned to be a topical episode just like normal. But I'm afraid that after I got back from our pilgrimage to Italy, I got sick. I think it has something to do with sitting in a metal tube with coffin hacking sick people for 10 hours at a stretch. So I got a chest cold, and even though I was able to get over the active symptoms pretty quickly, it basically cost me a week of work through my loss of energy for a week. We also needed to have episode 379 recorded very quickly, so even though it wasn't my preference, I made a decision that we'd have to have a Weird Questions episode today, just so that we'd have some new content for the listeners, even though it wasn't the full new episode that I originally planned to deliver. So we're going to be having a few question-based episodes. Today's episode, number 379, is now a Weird Questions episode, and so is next week's episode, number 380, since next Friday is a Fifth Friday. Then we'll have our regularly scheduled Patrons Questions episode the week after that for episode 381. And those questions will be all new, since it'll be a Patrons Questions episode that we recorded while we were in Italy for the pilgrimage. Like I said, my preference would be to have all new topical episodes instead, but I hope that readers will appreciate the fact that I'm doing my best to try to at least have new content for you each Friday, instead of taking breaks where we have no new episode for you like many podcasts do, particularly podcasts that have long breaks between seasons, which is something that we don't do here on Mysterious World. We try to have something for you every single week. But I'm still doing the best I can for listeners, given the exigencies of time, travel, and illness. I'd also note that we're now catching up with the Weird Questions episodes to when I moved from California back to Arkansas 2 years ago. So you'll start seeing my current home studio in the background, and soon you'll be hearing me start to speak with an Arkansas accent in upcoming Weird Questions episodes, although next week we will temporarily jump back to California for scheduling reasons.
So, Jimmy, what topics are you going to be answering questions about today?
We're going to be talking about things like, where did the idea of aerial toll booths in the afterlife come from? Can a layperson function as a priest in extraordinary circumstances? Did Balaam's ass have a rational soul? Were men and angels fated to fall, or could they have done otherwise? If Middle Earth was real, could God have become incarnate in multiple races? And more.
Very good. And let's listen to your answers to those questions.
Welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Kellett, your host, and if you're not familiar with that music signals that it's time for some weird questions with Jimmy Akin. And if you haven't heard Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin before, get ready because they got to reach a certain standard of weirdness to make it. So we got 2 good hours of weird questions coming up and more of that music to come. Jimmy Akin, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Hello, Kellett.
All right, the weird questions, Jimmy, come from all over, right? You get some of these weird questions. Mm-hmm. I guess some of them are emailed to us. And if a person has a weird question, and you can just email it to radio@catholic.com. We'll get it to Jimmy. And how have you rated these? Like, how weird are we going today? Are we?
Well, there's a variety. I don't rate them.
Okay.
If something is not really weird at all, I may move it over to a list of regular internet open forum questions, but most of them have at least some element of weirdness in them. Although our first question isn't so much weird as it is just not not familiar to many people in the Western Church.
Okay. Well, we'll start there with Aaron, who asks, where does the idea of toll booths come from? And why didn't it make its way into the Western Church?
Well, I think the idea of toll booths is somehow connected to the DMV, and it didn't make it into the Western Church because the DMV is intrinsically evil.
That may be the case, but I don't think that was right at all.
No, it's what Aaron's talking about is a concept that one finds in Eastern Orthodoxy and in some other Eastern non-Catholic churches. The idea is, he refers to them as toll booths. They're also sometimes called toll houses or aerial toll houses because they're depicted as not being here on earth, but as being up in the air in the spiritual realm. And the idea is one that goes back way far. It's mentioned, for example, in St. Athanasius's book, The Life of St. Anthony the Great. And St. Anthony the Great lived in the second half of the 3rd century and the first half of the 4th century, so between like 250 and 350, and he was a desert hermit that had many mystical experiences. And in talking about his life, St. Athanasius mentions the aerial toll houses. They're also mentioned in other early patristic works, especially in Eastern Christendom. And the basic idea is that what happens, and by the way, there's a pretty good article on them on Wikipedia if you just search on aerial toll houses. But the idea is when you die, angels come and they pick you up and they escort you to God. But on the way, just like you're traveling a road, only it's in the spiritual world, you encounter certain toll houses. And in these toll houses, now here on earth, what a toll house does is it collects a toll from you. And so you have to pay a toll in order to use a particular highway, and it thus takes a toll on you, to use the term in the sense it originally came from. Well, something similar happens. People don't like paying tolls when they're driving down the highway, and so it's an unpleasant experience to have to pay a toll. And something similar happens in these aerial toll houses, only instead of a monetary payment, it's sort of a spiritual thing that happens. According to the way toll houses are envisioned, there are demons in them. And there are, biblical passages that associate demons with the atmosphere, like Lucifer is called, or Satan is called, the prince of the power of the air by St. Paul, for example. Right. And there are early Christian works, such as the Ascension of Isaiah, that depict the atmosphere. And this is not literally true, but this is how it's depicted. They depict the atmosphere below the first heaven as being infested with demons. And then when you get up into the first heaven, you meet angels, and you meet more and more powerful angels as you make your way up to God. But it was a common image to picture demons as living in our atmosphere. And so what happens is you go to a toll house, there is one or more demons in the toll house, and what they do is they confront you with sins you committed during life. Although, in a really frightening way. Although some Eastern sources will say that if you repented of the sin, they don't know about it. It's been deleted from their memory bank. But what they want to do is frighten you and cause you anxiety and possibly even drag you down to hell. But if you love and trust God, you died in God's friendship, you're going to be able to resist this. You're not going to be super terrified. You'll be able to go through the toll house, and the angels will continue escorting you on until you reach God. And this is essentially another way of picturing purgatory, which is the process by which we are made ready for God's presence that involves dealing with sins that we committed in life that we have been forgiven the eternal consequence of, but we still have disordered desires. Like if you loved pizza too much until your death, well, that's not a mortal sin, but you're not going to be held back in God's presence by your disordered desires. So you need to be freed from those. And that's what purgatory does, according to the Catechism. It frees you of any disordered attachments that you had during life. And this sort of confrontation with your sins sort of kind of does the same thing. And so there have even been Eastern sources that have said that this is the same thing as purgatory. It's just a different way of picturing it. And I should mention that this view, although it's very common in Eastern Christianity, is not universally held by like Eastern Orthodox theologians. There are some theologians who reject this view, and some who will even call it heretical, but they must be using the term heresy in a different sense than it's used in the Catholic Church. So it's not agreed to by everybody, but it is very common, and it's essentially an alternative presentation of purgatory. As to why it didn't make its way into the Western Church, or at least become a dominant view in the Western Church, well, essentially because Western Christians developed another way of picturing this process of purification before we get to God. And they commonly pictured it as an application of not of confrontation with demons, but as an application of fire to the soul. And that goes along with some imagery that St. Paul uses in 1 Corinthians, where he says our works are going to be tested by fire. Now, modern theologians in the Western Church tend to regard this fire as not literal. It's not really, because they would ask the question, how could literal fire affect a non-physical soul? Fire is a state of matter, it's a plasma, but the soul is not made of matter. So how could plasma affect it? And some medieval theologians came up with arguments to try to say, well, here's how I think a physical fire could affect a non-physical soul. But that view is not widely received today. And so it's generally regarded in the West that the fire imagery is based on biblical imagery, but it's not meant to be taken literally. And some theologians, including Pope Benedict XVI, have suggested that the fire actually may be a symbol of the fiery love of Christ, that he loves us so much that an encounter with his love will burn away all of our impurities, so that we will be freed from our disordered attachments and can be perfectly happy with God in heaven without being distracted by negative disordered attachments. There's an interesting question, and I've seen some sources actually talk about this. But, so I mentioned where we got the fire imagery in the West. We got it from St. Paul. But, because the afterlife is something we haven't experienced, it can be pictured in different ways. And it's something that transcends our current ability to understand, where our minds are not configured for the afterlife in this life. So it exceeds what we're actually able to understand. And there are different ways of picturing it. And there has been some discussion of, well, what might have influenced the imagery that's used in the toll houses. And one thing that occurred to me, because where St. Athanasius lived and where St. Anthony the Great lived,
I believe they were Egyptians.
That's right. They were in Egypt. And one of the things that occurred to me is that the Egyptian idea of the afterlife, the pre-Christian Egyptian idea of the afterlife, may have influenced this. I talked about this in episode 240 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, so you can go to mysterious.fm/240 to hear about it. I interviewed Egyptologist Dr. Bob Breyer, and one of the things we talked about was how the Egyptians conceived of the afterlife. Basically, they thought that the pre-Christian Egyptians thought that when you die, you have to go through a series of gates. And at each of these gates, you're confronted by monstrous beings, monstrous, godlike, demonic beings who will try to do bad things to you. But if you know the right things to say, you can get past them. And that's actually what the Egyptian Book of the Dead is. It's a record of what you're supposed to say at each of the gates that you're going to encounter so that you can make it safely to the place of the gods. And so you have a very similar image here. You're trying to go get to be with the gods. You got to go through a series of stations. And if you do the right things at these stations, you get to be with God. And that's very similar to what we see with the toll houses. The angels are escorting you along this progression of different stations, and you've got to successfully get through the stations, which you will if you're a Christian and trust God. And then you ultimately get to be with God. And so the concept of the afterlife that the Egyptians had prior to Christianization sounds similar to the concept that of the aerial toll houses. And of course, in the 200s and 300s, you still had a lot of pagans in Egypt alongside Christian Egyptians. And so it was part of their culture to think about the afterlife in this way. And that, to my mind, is a plausible explanation for where this imagery came from. I've also seen it suggested that it might be related to the Bardo Thadol, which is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but I'm skeptical of that because I've read the Bardo Thadol and it's not like this.
Yeah.
Also, there was no real contact between Tibet and Egypt in the first few centuries AD. So I think the Egyptian Book of the Dead may have influenced it, but probably not the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In any event, it's not. Presumably, the afterlife is more than we can understand or can visualize, but this is one way that the post-mortem process of getting to God has been pictured in Christian tradition.
Aaron, thanks for starting us off. As Jimmy said, it's not the weirdest question, but it's certainly a very unfamiliar territory to many of us in the West. I'm very glad you brought us that question. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. All right, this weird question comes from Steve, and Steve got me all wrapped up in it. This is what he says, Jimmy. Scotty had a little too much to drink again and staggers down to the control room at 2 a.m. and accidentally beams up Cy. During the transport, Scotty inadvertently pushes the wrong buttons and mistakenly erases Cy's memory. Captain Kirk tells Spock to try the Vulcan mind meld, hoping they can find out some information about this confused guy with the Society 315 t-shirt. During the mind meld, Spock dies. Now, Cy thinks he's Spock. The crew decides to keep him around for entertainment purposes. Unfortunately, Cy begins worshiping Vulcan gods and then begins preaching about them and proselytizing to the crew like he's Jimmy Swaggart. Kirk has had just about enough of this and drops him off on some planet in the Delta Quadrant where Cy lives out his days eating plants and worshiping green lava. Even though he's now worshiping lava with full knowledge and consent, it's through no fault of his own. He didn't ask to be beamed up and have his memory erased and then brainwashed into thinking he's Spock. Can he still be saved? Or is he lost in space?
So, first thing, serious points for the Lost in Space reference. In fact, even if this whole story was created just to do is he saved or is he lost in space, it's worth it. So that's a great reference, in particular because the original Star Trek series was on the air at the same time Lost in Space was.
Yeah.
So points for that. So here's what I can tell you in analyzing the scenario. The first thing is if you become incapacitated so that you are no longer thinking in your right mind. And this could happen, for example, if you go into a coma or you suffer a traumatic brain injury or you have your memory erased and new memories implanted. It would qualify. You didn't do anything to bring the situation about, and consequently, you're not responsible for what happened to you. And so your soul will remain in the same state that it was in before you had this event that caused you to no longer be in your right mind. Another thing could happen. Someone could sneak up behind you and inject you with some serious hallucinogen. or something like that. You're not responsible for what you do under the effects of the hallucinogen. There also was an actual case in the 19th century here in America. I'm blanking on his name, but there was a railroad worker who accidentally had a railroad spike driven through his head. And he survived, but it totally changed his personality. Before the railroad spike incident, he had been a nice, considerate person, and he became mean and abrasive afterwards. But that wasn't his fault. So he wasn't responsible for the meanness and abrasiveness he displayed to other people. And in the same way, if this scenario happens and Sai thinks he's Spock and starts proselytizing for Vulcan gods and worshiping green lava, then Sai's not responsible for that. And so the state of his soul will be the same as it was before this transporter accident mind meld fiasco. So if he was already in a state of grace, then he would continue to be in a state of grace. If he was not in a state of grace, he would continue not to be in a state of grace. Well, what about whether he'll stay that way? Well, let's assume he was in a state of grace. Are there any situations, given that he's not in his right mind, where he could end up committing a mortal sin? And I think the answer to this is yes, but it won't be a mortal sin based on his previous beliefs. It will be a mortal sin based on his current beliefs. So, for example, if he thinks green lava is super holy and divine, and one day he just he decides it would be gravely sinful for me to spit on green lava, as a sign of defiance to the god of green lava. It would desecrate the green lava, kind of like stamping on the Eucharist or something. And I don't care. I know it's wrong. I know it's gravely wrong to spit on green lava, but I'm going to deliberately spit on it anyway. Well, his belief is mistaken. But if he, with full knowledge and full deliberation, decides to defy his belief and desecrate the green lava, then that would be a mortal sin, because what he's really agreeing to on the human level is, I'm willing to do an act of grave sacrilege. And it doesn't matter that he's misidentified what is actually super holy. Mm-hmm. What he's doing with his will, if he's doing it fully deliberately, is choosing to deliberately commit grave sacrilege against what he regards as supremely holy. So I think it would be possible for him to commit a mortal sin and lose the state of grace, given his current belief system. Would he then be able to return to a state of grace? And again, I think the answer is yes. If he then repents of the act of having committed grave sacrilege against what he regards as divine, and if he even if he's praying to a green lava god, if he sincerely repents of having committed grave sacrilege against the divine, and if his contrition is perfect, meaning based on the motive of love of the divine, then he would be restored to grace, because even though he's ignorant of the true God, he nevertheless is orienting his will to having love for the supreme being as he understands it. And by orienting his will to have love for the supreme being, that would restore him to a state of grace with the true God that he has mistakenly confused with the green lava.
All right.
So he could return to the state of grace.
Steve, thank you for the question, I guess. I mean, it didn't work out so good for me in the question, but thank you very much for the question.
Well, I mean, Trent, I don't know if he's still doing it, but when you talk to Trent, he has a tradition of killing you off in his examples, right?
Yes, he does. And I think he took so much flack for it that now he just usually inflicts some horrible pain on me. He doesn't actually kill me.
Okay.
So,
well, that's a little nicer.
I know, we're working our way towards friendship, one step at a time. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. This one comes from an anonymous questioner. My question is, if a group of people were stranded on a deserted island like in the TV show Lost, and there was no priest among them, could a layperson declare himself a priest and perform valid sacraments? Would the validity of the sacraments be contingent on how closely this person stuck to the teaching of the church? That is, what if he had a suitcase full of Catholic books and was on his way to be ordained as a priest when the plane crashed?
Okay, so there are some follow-ups to this, but to answer that question, you can't just declare yourself a priest. It doesn't work that way. You have to be ordained. And so consequently, the only sacraments that this person could validly perform would be the ones that don't require a priest: baptism and matrimony. And so those two would be valid. He could validly baptize people, and he could validly consent to be married or witness at a marriage. But it would be only those two sacraments.
All right. So as you said, there's some follow-ups here. If the answer is that the sacraments would be invalid, which I suspect is the case, our anonymous questioner asks, I have a couple of follow-up questions. Could the unbaptized be saved through perfect contrition?
Yes, they could be saved through perfect contrition, but they don't need to stay unbaptized because anybody can baptize you. It does not require a priest. So this seminarian you mentioned would be able to baptize people, and perfect contrition wouldn't be required.
There's at least one more follow-up, maybe more than one, but we'll do that right after this. It's Jimmy Akin. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
We'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Michael F., Justin D., Ted H., Mark M., and Janet K. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by the debut novel Holy Terror by John R. Doherty. Holy Terror is a gripping supernatural thriller where horrific crimes reveal an invisible war between good and evil. As justice is delivered through mysterious, otherworldly means, detectives and agents uncover a force far greater than themselves. Holy Terror is a bold blend of crime, faith, and the paranormal. You can find author John R. Doherty at johnrdoherty.com. And for those who enjoy audiobooks, Holy Terror is also available on audible.com. Subscribers to John's email list can receive a free copy of the Bible Study Guide Companion at authorjohnrdoherty.com/subscribe. You can find both links in the show notes for this episode on our website.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest, and that's an awful good thing because the topic is Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin today. And here's one we're working on. We're working our way through a question from Anonymous, who gave us the scenario. Say a group of lay people were stranded on an island, as in the TV show Lost. Could one of them, maybe a seminarian who had crashed with them, just assume the role of a priest, just declare himself a priest and perform the sacraments, and then was asking about, well, what about the sacrament of baptism? And Jimmy, you were in the midst of answering, but do you want me to give you the next?
No, I was done with answering that one.
Yeah. Okay. So you want the. So then they asked, could the unbaptized person be saved through perfect contrition? And you said, yeah, but anybody can baptize. It doesn't. You don't need the priest for that. And then this is the next question. I don't think we got to this one. If this person married a couple who believed that the sacrament was valid, would the marriage be inadvertently valid as full knowledge and full consent is needed to commit a mortal sin?
The marriage would be valid, period, because you don't need a priest in order to perform a marriage. The standard understanding, at least in the Western Church, is that it's the consent of the two parties to be married that makes the marriage. And consequently, if you have two people and they consent to be married, they're going to be validly married. Now, Catholics are required to get married in the church except in special circumstances. But being stranded on a desert island with no priest is one of those circumstances. If you don't have access to a priest for 30 days, then if you're not going to have access to a priest for 30 days, then you can go ahead and get married without a priest, even if you're a Catholic. So this is going to be a valid marriage one way or another. Now, because we have been discussing both baptized and unbaptized people, I should also mention, after I've mentioned that it's going to be a valid marriage, will it be a sacramental marriage or not? And the answer is, if both parties who are getting married are baptized, it will be a valid sacramental marriage. If one or both of the parties are unbaptized, it will be a valid natural marriage, but not a sacramental one.
All right, and there's still more follow-ups to this. If the answer is that the sacraments would be valid, which would surprise me, I also have a couple of follow-up questions. What would make the sacraments invalid? And if there were no men aboard the plane, could a woman fulfill this role?
So for these two sacraments, in order to invalidate them, you'd have to use either the wrong form or the wrong matter, because they're not dependent on a particular minister. In terms of if there were no men, could a woman fulfill this role? Well, she could do baptism and marriage just like anybody else, but she would not be able to fulfill the role of a priest, and thus any additional sacraments that she wanted to perform beyond baptism and matrimony would not be valid, just like if a layman is usurping the role of a priest, any sacraments he performs beyond baptism and matrimony are not going to be valid. By the way, I also should mention, since Anonymous said in his initial scenario that that this guy was about to be ordained a priest anyway, when he was when the plane crash occurred, he's probably already a transitional deacon. Transitional deacons, what happens when you're getting ordained to the priesthood is you do all your studies and then they ordain you as a deacon. But you're not going to permanently remain in that state. So you're not a permanent deacon. Instead, they ordain you as a deacon, and then typically 6 months later, they do your priestly ordination. So you're transitioning from the lay state to the priesthood, and so you're using the diaconate as part of that transition. So you're called a transitional deacon. So if this guy was just about to get ordained as a priest, he's probably within that 6 months and would already be a transitional deacon. Now, deacons can't do any sacraments that laity are unable to do. Like laity, they can baptize people and they can officiate at matrimony as a witness, and so it wouldn't add any new abilities for him to do stuff if he was already a transitional deacon, but it would mean that he's able to do them in a more regular manner, since deacons are regularly assigned to do things of this nature. It's not as exceptional as if a layman does them.
This anonymous questioner, I just want to say thanked you in advance for taking the time, and said he knows we have lots and lots of questions, but I just wanted to tell you this part. I'm sending my love and prayers to all of you from the UK. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, we
appreciate it.
And
always great to hear from the UK.
Yeah, very much so. All right, it's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, and this one comes from Margie. Seeing that, and she puts this in quote, the Lord opened the mouth of Balaam's ass, and she said to Balaam, What? Okay. What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? And the ass said to Balaam, Am I not your ass upon which you have ridden all your life long to this day? Was I ever accustomed to do so to you? That's Numbers chapter 22. And her question is, did Balaam's ass have a rational soul?
So, rational souls are things that humans have on this planet. There may be creatures elsewhere in the universe that also have them, but animals do not have rational souls. And so, Balaam's ass would not have had a rational soul. How would we read this then? Well, one possibility is due to the influence of God. The animal, even though it's not intrinsically rational, it doesn't have a soul that's intrinsically rational, it was able by grace to momentarily have a rational thought and articulate it. Another possibility is that no, its insight level remained the same, but because of God's grace, Balaam was allowed to perceive it as saying what it's reported to say to him. So it's essentially like, kind of like a vision. It could be a physical vision where God animated the animal's speech centers in such a way that it could articulate this, or it could just be that Balaam had a more visionary experience. But this would be a way of divinely accommodating what the animal was thinking without language in a linguistic form so that Balaam could understand it. And this is kind of like, dogs. I mean, they have the ability. Most of us today are not overly familiar with asses because we don't live on a farm and we don't use asses for transportation the way they did. But a lot of people do have dogs, and various dog breeds are quite intelligent, and they're able to do things like get mad at their owners. I was talking with one of my neighbors, and he indicated that they had to, because the dog was doing something dangerous, they had to grab the dog and prevent it from doing this dangerous thing. And the dog got mad at them and stayed mad at them for a while because it didn't understand why they were suddenly restricting its freedom. And the dog didn't realize this is for its own protection. And so we do have situations where animals, like dogs, can get mad at their owners, and they're not able to articulate why they're mad because they don't have the faculty of speech, but they are able to experience the thought, you did something wrong to me. You shouldn't have done that. And so that may be what was going on in the head of Balaam's ass. She may have, got mad because he was beating her to try to get her to go forward, even though that she can see there's an angel in the road in front of them. And she's getting mad for, look, dude, I'm trying to protect you. Why are you beating me? Why would you do this? We have this long-standing relationship, and I'm trying to help you out. What's the justification for this? And she's angry about that. She doesn't have the ability naturally to articulate all of that, but either through a momentary miracle that elevated her level of articulation, or through a momentary miracle that let Balaam perceive what she's thinking in linguistic terms so he could understand it. This experience allowed him, or at least the way it's presented in the text, this experience allowed him to understand what the ass's concern was.
Thank you, Margie, very, very much for that question. Do you ever have a dog, Jimmy, where it looks like it wants to talk to you? Like you just swear that dog is about to say something, but thus far none of mine have, but they look like they want to sometimes. Like they just got that look on their face like, I'm about to explain something to you.
Dogs are able to understand a considerable amount of human language. Now, they don't understand it all, but they can recognize words and they can figure things out. Border collies, for example, are one of the most most intelligent dog breeds, and some of them can memorize 1,000 words in English. I saw a video about a border collie that had memorized the names of 1,000 different toys, and its owner could say, "Go get go get Glinda, the good witch, and it'll bring the right toy out of these 1,000 toys.
Yeah.
And it was even able to use process of elimination. So what they did was they put a new toy that it didn't know the name of. I'm going to call the new toy Bob. They put this new toy in its pile of toys in another room so it can't see what they're doing. And then they would say, go get Bob. And the dog would go in and it would look around and it would be confused. And they had to say it a few times. So the dog went back and forth a few times. But eventually the dog figured out the new toy I don't know, that one must be named Bob.
That's amazing.
And it brought the Bob toy back. And so it was using process of elimination to deduce the name of this object that it had never seen before. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that there are situations where dogs understand what we're saying and they want to say something back to us, but they just don't have this kind of speech track that would enable them to say the word. So all that comes out is woof.
Or
yeah.
All right, we'll take a quick break. Right back with more weird questions for Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Catholic Answers Live. There's some bear that stands on his back feet. I think it's in China. Did you see this, Jan? And there's a thing on the internet about people are convinced it's a man in a bear suit, but it's just a bear that learned people habits. Have you haven't seen that one?
I haven't seen that, but bears do stand and can even walk on their hind legs.
Yeah.
I did see a video a number of years ago called Standing Cat, which was a cat. It was standing like on the back of a sofa on its hind legs, and it's standing, it's just looking around. And so I did a blog post where I included the video, and I did a blog post that was titled something like "Everything You Need to Know About Standing Cat."
Oh, nice!
And it got a ton of views because Standing Cat. What's that?
Well, so this bear, it's some kind of it's a sun bear, and it does look freakishly human. Like it waves and does all this weird stuff, but it's a bear. All right, Patrick. It's weird questions with Jimmy Akin this hour, and this one comes from Patrick. Patrick asks, was it certain or contingent that Adam and Eve would fall, or that the angels would fall?
So in contrasting certain and contingent, Patrick means like, was it fated that this had to happen, or was it contingent on the free will decisions of the human or angels? And in both cases, the answer is the same. It was contingent. Humans fell because they misused their free will, and before that, angels fell, and maybe even after that too, angels fell because of their misuse of free will. However, God in both cases had foreknowledge that it would happen, but knowing something is going to happen doesn't mean you cause it to happen. It's not fated. So if I can tell, for example, and I've used this example before, if it's dinner time and I put a slice of pizza in front of Kellett,
you know what's going to happen.
I have foreknowledge of what's going to happen, but that doesn't mean he's not doing it by free will.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. Okay. I'm sorry. I started thinking about pizza, and then I lost my train of thought for a second. All right. So then Patrick goes on to ask these questions. If it is certain, could God create other rational beings for whom their fall would be contingent, and could they potentially persist and perpetually in the state of grace and obedience to God?
Yes, God can. A fall will be contingent for anybody who has free will such that they can choose between good and evil. And if they have free will such that they can choose between good and evil, they may consistently choose good. So they may not fall and may remain in a state of original righteousness perpetually.
And then he says, if it is contingent, could another human couple, same nature, different identity, have persisted in the state of grace and obedience to God perpetually in the Garden of Eden?
So if God had created additional couples, and we're not going to get into the science question of exactly how many couples were at the start of the human race, but if there were multiple couples and they were all created in a state of original righteousness, and one couple, Adam and Eve, fell, then the others would or would not have remained in a state of grace, depending on whether Adam and Eve were what are known as the federal heads of the human race. The idea of federal headship is there is an individual or a pair of individuals, or there's some people who are the heads of the race, such that if something happens to them, it has ripple effects on everybody else in the race. So if Adam and Eve lose sanctifying grace, then they would, if they were federal heads, they would lose it for everybody else in the human race too, not just later humans, but contemporary humans as well, who existed alongside them. On the other hand, if Adam and Eve are not the federal heads of the human race in the sense just described, then their fall would affect only them. Mm-hmm. They would lose sanctifying grace. Other people would remain in sanctifying grace, or in original righteousness, I should say, as long as they didn't choose to follow Adam and Eve's example by sinning.
All right. And then he asks for the angels. If they transcend space and time, how do we understand before and after, in heaven and not in heaven, with respect to their fall?
Church teaching is actually that all created beings, this is, you can find this in John Paul II. He discusses this in his audiences. Church teaching is that all created beings, which includes angels, are bound by space and time, are bound by time. And so it's only God that is truly outside of time and truly eternal in the proper sense. Everything else is subject to time. So angels have before and after. There is a time before angels fell and a time after angels fell. And they may not experience time the way we do. And there has been speculation, for example, among medieval theologians about how they experience time. Mm-hmm. That's all in the realm. It's not a matter of church teaching. It's all speculation. But it is agreed that they are subject to sequentiality and thus time in some sense, although they may perceive it differently than we do, sort of the way that various creatures here on Earth perceive time at different rates. You know, a sloth perceives time at a slower rate than a human. They just don't think as fast. So, but a housefly experiences time at a faster rate mm-hmm. than a human, which is why they're so hard to hit with a fly swatter, because they're thinking faster than we are, and they get ready to move. So angels may perceive time differently. They still go through it, but they may experience it differently than we do, just like some earthly creatures do. With respect to them being in heaven or not in heaven, well, so Pat asks, how do we understand in heaven and not in heaven with respect to their fall? Well, I mean, you could understand it sort of spiritually, geographically, as if heaven is a distinct place in the invisible world, and as long as they didn't sin, they were allowed in this space. And then after they sinned, they were kicked out of this space. So that's a possible understanding, a spatial understanding of heaven, even if it's not located in our universe. But it's also possible to understand heaven as a condition, where if you are in a state of original righteousness or sanctifying grace, you are in spiritual union with God. And if you're in full spiritual union with God, then you could be described as being in heaven. And if you then fall out of righteousness and grace, you would fall out of the state of being in full spiritual union with God. And so this would be more of a relational understanding of heaven, because your relationship with God changes depending on your degree of union with him. And so the angels that were in original righteousness would have been in full union with God, and then when they sinned, they lost full union with God. And we could describe that as them either being in heaven or not being in heaven based on their relationship to God, rather than their location in a spatial realm of some kind.
All right. Patrick, thank you very much for those questions. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, and we've got a lot of really interesting ones. This one comes from Jacob. Suppose Middle Earth really existed. Could God become incarnate as a man, an elf, a dwarf, and a hobbit, all at the same time? If yes, Could man, elf, dwarf, and hobbit Jesus interact with each other and maybe all go out for a pint?
Okay, so this will come now. There's no church teaching on this, but I think the answer is pretty straightforward. And a lot of people would be surprised to learn this, but Thomas Aquinas, he didn't use Middle Earth as an example, but he did address questions like, could Christ incarnate more than once at the same time? And could the Father and the Holy Spirit also incarnate in multiple bodies? And could they take on different natures? And so they don't all have to be human. And could they all incarnate as this in the same body? And when it comes to the last question, the answer is, well, they can't all be hypostatically united to that one body, but they could all be active in the one body. When it comes to the other questions, like could any person of the Trinity incarnate multiple times in different bodies at the same time and of different natures, the answer is yes. And I think Aquinas is right on this one, because if it's possible, God can do anything logically possible. That's what omnipotence is. And if it's logically possible for Christ for the Son to incarnate as a human and take on this additional nature, then that reveals there's no contradiction if you say the Son incarnates with one human nature. Well, it doesn't add a logical contradiction if you say the Son incarnates in 2 human natures or 3 human natures or 5,000 human natures. And so he could incarnate in multiple natures. And since I didn't say anything in those statements about time, they could all happen at the same time. And Aquinas would say, and I think he's right, if God can unite his divine nature to a human nature, he can unite it to any nature he wants. And so consequently, he could, if there was such a thing as an elf nature and a dwarf nature and a hobbit nature, although hobbits, I think, are really supposed to be a species of human, but I could be mistaken. If there are these multiple natures, well, there's no reason he can't unite himself to them. So the answer is yes. He could, if Middle Earth was real, the Son could, by his divine omnipotence, assume each one of these natures. And if he assumed them all living in the same time period, well, there's no logical contradiction in saying these people go down to a pub and have a pint together. So omnipotence would allow interactions between his different incarnations.
Wow.
That's probably one of the weirder questions today.
Yeah, that's pretty weird. Yeah. So I just want to clarify one thing. Did I understand that God could be united to any nature, or it had to be a rational nature? Did you say? I missed.
I didn't say anything about that.
Okay.
Because if God can unite himself to a rational nature, he could unite his essence, his divine nature, to any created nature. Kind of like I could stick my hand in a glove. The glove doesn't have to be intelligent.
Right. It's also fascinating to think that Thomas Aquinas dealt with it, not the Middle Earth part, but in the general,
principles.
The principle of the question. Jacob, thank you. You gave us a really weird one to end that hour on. But
so now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. And our feedback is coming from our episode on the Drake equation. And the first one comes from KnightU2160 on YouTube, who writes, I'm not sure what adding a spread variable would add to the equation. Just as many proposed variables are just subsets of whether a planet is habitable, spread is basically a subset of whether life develops on the planet, considering that we decided not to differentiate between life evolving from non-living matter versus life being seeded from another source. In my mind, spread is a subset of life being seeded from another source. Whether this happens before or after technology develops makes no difference to the number of inhabited planets. Perhaps spread could be a way of adding in uninhabitable planets that have been terraformed, though. Another thing that occurs to me is that this equation should also factor in the time our civilization lasts. Yes, some alien civilizations may have detectable technology for thousands of years, but we may never detect them if their civilization doesn't overlap in time with ours. Of course, time being relative, this may mean that if they are far enough away, we could detect a past civilization that has currently died out. The distances could make conversation difficult if it takes a long time to receive a message and also send a reply. In addition, it takes billions of years for intelligent life to develop. It may still be in development. An interesting way to use the equation would be to apply it to only the planets that are in range of conversation with us and old enough to give civilization a chance to develop, and see what numbers we might get then.
So there's multiple different ways that one can use the principles involved in the Drake equation to make some interesting calculations, including the ones that Knight U mentions at the end. The reason that I included a spread factor in my version of the equation is because even though you can conceptualize the matters the way Knight U is proposing, they're not the way that most scientists typically think about them. They typically think about life originating on a single planet naturally, from non-life. They think of abiogenesis happening somewhere. And if you assume, as the original authors of the Drake equation did, that life is only going to originate on a single planet and then not spread to other solar systems, you may be missing out on some solar systems that have intelligent life we could detect. If a species arises by abiogenesis in one location but then spreads to multiple other star systems, you're going to be missing some places that you could potentially detect and maybe even talk to, although talking to them is really a separate question than just detecting them. So I wanted to include an additional factor that would account for the fact a civilization might spread from one star system to another. I didn't really include it. I didn't really include the idea of spread to other planets in the same star system, because the targets here have historically been stars where we find some kind of technosignature. And even if you're on 3 planets in the same star system, like let's say Earth colonized, Mars and Venus, that would still be one target, our sun, as a site for technosignatures. So I wanted to look at civilizations that had spread not just on an interplanetary scale, but on an interstellar scale in ways that did not involve new abiogenesis. At least that's the reason that that I took the approach I did. You also could expect that some planets that were not otherwise habitable might be terraformed. Like if we colonized Venus, presumably we'd be in the clouds of Venus. And so you wouldn't expect that planet to be habitable, but technologically it could become habitable. Also, the calculation is meant to show how many civilizations currently exist that we could currently detect. So how long our civilization lasts in order to make those detections is sort of implicit in the equation, and the equation only looks at what we could currently detect, not what abilities we might develop in the future to find technosignatures, since that's less certain.
Right. And our next feedback comes from Rob Chinkota via email, who writes, "Hello, Mysterious World. Great episode. I've heard of the Drake equation, but Jimmy's breakdown and development of estimates helped me understand the estimators and terms better. I think I disagree with some of Jimmy's numbers for his terms. In particular, I would change the ones where Earth is the only example available. The trouble with using 50% as the baseline for unknown values here is that Earth is not a typical planet, so I would use a much lower number for these terms to capture the oddness of Earth. While there are a couple of non-average features of Earth and its solar system, I think the biggest difference between Earth and the other planet we know is that Earth has a large resonant moon. I've heard that this was formed by a large but not quite catastrophic collision, that is, not quite big enough to destroy the integrity of Earth and leave only bits and pieces. This resonant moon has slowed precession about Earth's axis, resulting in long-term, stable climates and seasons which seem necessary to have niches that support complex life. Can you have a niche if the weather and terrain are changing chaotically? And may have contributed in other ways too. While I don't think there are any positively identified exomoons presently within the solar system, no other planets have anywhere near a similar moon, close to 10% of Earth's mass, but not large enough to move the barycenter outside of Earth's sphere in a tidally locked resonant orbit. And the planets which showed signs of similar collisions seem to have other barriers to life, like Uranus's odd axial tilt. I guess arguing the other way, we have no way of knowing how necessary this oddity is for habitability, the emergence of intelligence and technology, or the duration of intelligent life existing. What do you think? Are these features as rare as I think? Thanks.
Well, everyone is welcome to plug in whatever numbers they think are most likely and see what results they get. So you don't have to agree with my numbers. I'm not sure that I'd rank Earth's moon as being as unique as you do, because Titan, Saturn's largest moon, is larger than our moon. In fact, Titan is even larger than the planet Mercury. It's less of the size of Saturn itself, but it's still bigger as a moon than our own moon is. I have heard arguments about Earth's moon being needed for life. That's something that I know was speculated on back in like the 60s and 70s. However, this has not been generally received as one of the variables in the Drake equation by people who are more expert in this area than I am. So I didn't attempt to include it as one of the factors, since the experts don't seem to be including it either. If you wanted to include it, I would probably include it as either part of the habitability factor or the duration factor of a civilization.
Right. Then Mike sends in this email. Hi, Jimmy. I've been following you on Catholic Answers for years. You're blessed with an amazing ability to reason and communicate. These questions came to mind when listening to your episode 372 on the Drake equation. If life arose on Earth naturally from non-life, then could this non-life to life transition still be happening? Why would it stop? After all, it seems to me that the transition should accelerate given the environment today is more conducive to life as we know it than billions of years in the past. Has anyone ever tested this hypothesis? Thanks, Mike.
So abiogenesis, or the emergence of life from non-living matter, would continue on other planets as a natural process. It has been classically assumed to have happened only once on Earth, but I don't see a good reason for that. And I've lately started to see scientists making the point that life actually may have originated more than once here on Earth. If so, it may have been outcompeted by the life that already existed. So it may have started multiple times, but since one batch of life was already going great guns, it may have eaten up all the rest. And so it might not be around today, even though it started more than once. The other starts of life may have kind of fizzled out because they were outcompeted. On the other hand, life from a different instance of abiogenesis may still be out there on Earth, and we may just have not discovered it or recognized what it is yet.
All right. That's all our feedback for this time. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the listeners' weird questions we heard today? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Check it out at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, do all the YouTube things, like, comment, share the podcast, and subscribe. And be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new episode out. I try to have new episodes of one of my many ventures out every day of the week.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Well, next Friday is a fifth Friday, so we're going to be looking at questions like, what will we be doing after the resurrection? You know, will we be, for example, evangelizing other planets? Why did humans take so long to develop modern culture and technology? What should we think about UFOs in light of recent UAP disclosures? If God is not made of parts, what will we see in heaven? What was the reason for Lucifer's rebellion? What do I think of spontaneous human combustion? Did humans mature earlier in the past? What's the morality of joining an effort to colonize Mars? And did Jesus have opinions that are not binding on us, like, favorite foods or colors, and more?
Very cool. Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should hit that bell to get notifications. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/379. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.